All right. Well, there were a couple of slides there, pictures of me and the former mayor of New York City, David Dinkins, the first black mayor of the city. And then also there's a picture there of me and another former mayor of New York City, Ed Koch, a Democrat who served in New York City back in the 80s while we were there. The point I'm trying to make in showing these shots is that we familiarized ourselves with the mayor. We had a relationship with the mayor. We had relationships with the borough presidents, et cetera, because we recognized that to be effective in urban ministry, we could not be aloof or we could not be standoffish. We had to be a part and parcel of that community, and we had to have relationships formed and established and cultivated with the mayors of the city. So there's a picture here of me with David Dinkins, a picture of me and Ed Koch, who came to our church, actually, the Hanson Place Church, and had town hall meetings, not only listening to members of the church, but also members of that community. One of the things we brought to his attention when he came was that there was an increase in crime in the neighborhood, and we wanted a greater police presence. He said, of course, the city at that time had some budget challenges and they weren't able to, but he told us if we supplied deacons and deaconesses, they would train them and they would become auxiliary New York City police officers. And that's what we did. And they trained a certain number of deacons and deaconesses who then were outfitted with New York City police uniforms. The only thing they did not carry was a gun. That's the only thing they did not carry, a gun, but they looked like bona fide cops. They were called on, for example, in 1990, when Nelson Mandela came to New York City, many of our cops were deployed in the Fort Greene section there, right there of Brooklyn, New York. And we thank God again that we were able to provide that police presence, all because, again, we got in with the mayor, and he gave us a budget to train men and women to be auxiliary New York City police officers, which they became, and they served not just in the vicinity of the church, but also the city at large. They were called upon. The only thing, like I said, that they did not have were guns. All right, so here are some pointers, but before I get into the pointers, I just want to underscore what we all know, and that is ours is an urban world. More than half of the population of the world today live in cities. Let's just face it, let's just embrace it, and that will continue. But now, when I utter the word city, what kinds of images are conjured up in your mind? When you hear the word city mentioned, what do you think about? Anyone? This is going to be interactive. Anyone? Poverty. See that? First word, poverty. Poverty. Anybody else? Crime. Okay? Crime, poverty. Two negatives. Anybody else? Immigrants. Immigrants. Okay? Immigrants. High walls and security gates. All right? Back to crime. Okay? So you got to protect your property because of crime in the cities. What else? Oh, finally we got a positive term. Opportunity. So far we're hearing crime, this, that, poverty. But opportunity, thank God for the positive image. Opportunity. Diversity. Diverse nationalities. Going back to the issue of immigration. Because there's so much immigration, you have diversity, you have people from around the world. Cities are virtual what? Melting pots of people coming from east, west, north, and south, and flooding the urban communities because they are looking for opportunities. Anybody else? Yes, way back there. Overcrowding. What's the population of Johannesburg? 8 point something million, which is equivalent to New York City. New York City, 8 million people. But there are cities, Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Bangkok in Thailand. There are cities with 17 million people, 20 million people. They are called mega cities when you add the suburbs and so forth. So people, people, people. Anybody else? One more. Politicians are? Politicians are executives. And executives. Okay, politicians. I did say one else, but I see this brother here. He wants to talk. He wants to say something. Technology. Okay, so that gets back to opportunity. But what we heard, crime, corruption, chaos, pollution, you know, the images tend to be negative. Crime, pollution, corruption, chaos, so forth. Seldom do we hear about commerce, culture. Seldom do we hear of education, the advancement of civilization. Cities, again, tend to conjure up in our minds these negative images. And when it comes to the church, you would hear folk misquoting Ellen White saying that, oh, there's the picture of me with Ed Koch. That's the picture there of Ed Koch, a former mayor of New York City. We brought him to our church, the Hanson Place Church in Brooklyn, New York, where we engaged him in conversation. And he used to go around and have these town hall meetings, feeling his pulse, asking the residents of New York City, how am I doing? How am I doing? How am I doing? Well, again, we were not standoffish. We had a relationship with this mayor, and we had a relationship, let's go on to the next slide. We had a relationship with the other mayor whose picture is not coming up, but that's all right. The point I'm trying to make is that in New York City, while we served, we didn't just talk the talk, but we walked the walk. We had relationships with these powerful men who led the city of New York, Ed Koch and David Dinkins, the first black mayor. All right, so again, there are these negative images of the city when we talk about the city. Now, if I were to ask you, what are some of the characteristics of cities, how would you respond? What would you say? The characteristics of cities. There are three dominant characteristics of cities. Let me see if you can hazard a guess and guess any one of those three. Anyone? What's the characteristics of a city? Yes. Technology. Okay. All right. Thank you. Over here. Fast-paced. Okay. All right. Thank you. Anybody else? I beg your pardon? Multiculturality. Yes. Back to diversity. We're going to get to that in a moment. Thank you. A high standard of living. Okay. A high standard of living. All right. One more over here. Entertainment. All right. The arts. Yeah, the arts. The operas, so forth and so on. Broadway, New York. Tend to dominate in these large cities. Well, here are the three things I was looking for. And that is, one, anonymity. Number two, mobility. And number three, heterogeneity. So first, anonymity. What do we mean by that? Well, you would think that because there are so many people who are together, clamped together, overcrowding in cities, in high-rises and so forth, that there will be much community. But the fact of the matter is, because cities tend to draw immigrants from around the world, there's a lot of anonymity. People really don't know each other. You live in the same apartment building with someone maybe for years, and you don't know the person across the hall from you. You see, because you tend to keep to yourself. And there's a reason for that, and that is, again, because there's so much immigration that in some parts of the city, there are people who are, quote-unquote, illegal residents. I've pastored churches in New York where if the immigration folk had moved in on Sabbath, half the church would run. You see? Half the church would take off, including the head elder from the head elder. including the first elder. So there's a lot of anonymity, which has implications for the church in terms of evangelism, in terms of knocking door to door. Folk don't want to open the door. Well, who's on the other side? It could be the folk from the INS, the immigration folk or the government. And so there is a lot of anonymity. Then there's mobility again, because people move. People move because they're trying to stay beneath the radar, under the radar, so they keep moving. You see? And again, as a pastor, I've pastored congregations where you just miss someone. And where's Brother so-and-so? Where's Sister so-and-so? Well, they took off, you see, because you got to keep moving to elude the authorities per se. Hello, somebody. Heterogeneity, because again, you have people from around the world. New York City, the proverbial melting pot. Johannesburg, I suppose, is also a melting pot here with people from other countries on the continent here. So there's a lot of that. Now, one last issue we have to deal with briefly, or at least mention, we won't be dealing with it, but just mentioning it, and that is, of course, in Adventism, there's this belief that we need to flee the cities. Have you ever heard that? We got to flee the cities, especially as we get to the end of time, and there are those who will misquote Ellen White, saying that the servant of the Lord told us that we need to flee the city. Well, that is not so. But here's some principles and some truths that will lead to effective urban mission. Can we go to the screen? Number one, our response must be incarnational. Must be what, everybody? Okay, let's move forward. The response must be incarnational. The urban minister cannot be a what, everybody? Cannot be a commuter. She or he must seek to emulate Jesus, who was first and foremost incarnational. Jesus is the best example of contextualization. He became part and parcel of the place and people he came to save. What are we saying here? We're essentially saying that if we are going to impact the urban community for good, if we are going to bring lasting change to the urban centers, then we ourselves must immerse ourselves in the urban community. We must become a part and parcel of the urban community. Okay, we can't engage in what we call drive-by ministry, which we don't live where we serve. I served at Andrews University in Berrien Springs, Michigan for quite some time, quintessentially rural or suburban to say, at best. And we used to go down to Benton Harbor, which is a small city in the shadow of Berrien Springs, Michigan, and engage in ministry. And I remember once the mayor of that small city of 9,000 people, and I never considered Benton Harbor a city because the population is 9 million. There are some apartment buildings in New York City that have more than 10,000 people. Anyhow, the mayor of Benton Harbor said to us once, we are sick and tired of you folk from Andrews coming down here and telling us what to do and what not to do. They said, why don't you move here and live here? You'd have a greater impact here. We're sick and tired of you folk from Andrews coming down here telling us what to do and what not to do. So we must be a part and parcel of that community. Unfortunately, and admittedly, back in the States, many of our pastors and our members do not live anymore where those churches are located. We have moved out to the suburb. That's the aim and the ambition and the goal of many people, to what they call uplift and flight. to better themselves and then to move on to the suburbs and to the rural areas. But we drive back into the city for service on Sabbath, and then we drive home. But we don't live where those churches are, which prompts the question, which I've heard asked, and that is, if the church were to burn down overnight, would you be missed? Would the congregation be missed? And if so, why? Would you be missed? If you would not be missed, they say, then you really do need to move the church, because it means that there's no impact, that you're not really impacting that place. So we must decide to become part and parcel of the community. How does that grab you? Does that excite you? Or are you saying, well, does that pose a challenge for you, Brother Pastor? Again, so we must be incarnational. Let's move on. The response must be personal. Personal. God is a personal God who created us to be personal beings, and the personal approach is the foundation of personal and urban ministry. In other words, we cannot engage in urban ministry by proxy. No. Again, back to the issue of incarnationality, we've got to be where the people are. Jesus was where the people were. He touched people. He himself declared that, he had come to change lives. Ellen White says that he mingled with the people. He met their needs. Then he called them to follow him. So we have got to realize that we have got to have this personal touch and this personal approach if urban ministry is going to be effective. Then our response to the challenges of the urban community must be cross-cultural. Must be cross-cultural. Our president will be talking to us shortly here about cross-cultural, not just cross-cultural communication, but cross-cultural issues. Because, again, we have so much diversity in the urban community, then we must understand that we have got to cross barriers, cultural barriers. We have got to be like Jesus was when he went through Samaria and encountered that woman at the well and ministered to her. Jews and Samaritans had no dealings with each other. But in this generation, we've got to be like Jesus was, where we've got to surmount cultural barriers and encounter people who don't look like us, who don't dress like us, who don't worship like us, who don't eat like us. Again, if we are going to impact the urban community for good, we have got to be cross-cultural. Those who are daunted by diversity will not survive or succeed in urban mission. Cities are melting pots, and only those skilled at crossing ethnic and cultural boundaries will be effective in urban mission. Can I get an amen out there? All right, the response must be supernatural, right? Why? Because there's a whole lot of sin in the urban community. Because Christians are caught up in the cosmic conflict of the ages, we must not downplay the evil that abounds in the cities. All right? Yet God is calling us to the city, to the abode of much that is anti-God and the place of intense spiritual warfare. God is calling us, again, to encounter the principalities and powers and the evil that we find resident in the urban centers of the world. Urban mission must be grounded in the Word of God and draw its strength from the knowledge that greater is He who is in us than he who is in the world. Again, so we must understand that we are caught up in a supernatural struggle, and we are going to have to rely on the power resident in God, and that God has promised us if we are going to engage the urban community with intentionality and with integrity. The response must also be intentional. Intentionality helps to preserve or maximize the meager resources and starves of burnout, which is an occupational hazard of urban mission. Intentionality is a byproduct of strategic thinking and planning. We've got a plan. It contributes to church plans and ministry that meet real urban needs and lead to the transformation of communities and the empowerment of people. So there must be intentionality. It's a byproduct of strategic thinking and planning. We have got to think, we've got to assess, we've got to discover, we've got to train, then multiply, care, and coach those, especially those who will be involved in church planting in the urban centers. It contributes, this is intentionality, it contributes to church plants and ministry that meet real urban needs and lead to the transformation of communities and empowerment of people. All right, so the response also calls for people of credibility and integrity. I just shared with you the encounter I had with this mayor of Benton Harbor there in Michigan, in terms of folk coming down from Andrews University to Benton Harbor, Michigan. An unconditional commitment to the urban community that is exemplified by the urban minister becoming a part of the community almost always provides evidence that the urban minister possesses credibility and integrity. Back to New York, my context, many of the pastors live out on Long Island. Not in New York City, but on Long Island. Now, there's cities out there too, but Long Island, for the most part, tends to be more suburban than the city itself. The 5 boroughs, Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, Staten Island, and the Bronx. And they will claim that the reason they live out there is because housing is more affordable. It's more affordable, and that's true. And that's true. That's why I lived out there, because housing was more affordable. But the challenge with that is, then we drive in to lead our congregations, and most of our members also don't live in the immediate community of our churches. They live out in the island of Westchester County, New Jersey, so forth, and so on. But what that does, it takes away from our credibility. It takes away from our credibility and integrity, because it's one thing to talk about the ministry and ministering to the urban community, but when you come in and you go out, come in and you drive home, again, you lack or you lose credibility. You lose credibility. So we must become people of credibility and be people of credibility if we are going to serve with integrity. Yes, sir? Good. Yes, at the end. Thank you. So save your questions. We're getting there. The response must also, urban ministry must also, there must be a commitment to it being longitudinal. A commitment to stay in the urban community contributes to the credibility and integrity of the urban minister. How many of you remember 9/11? After 9/11, the North American Division got all hot about urban ministry, and so they moved a fellow by the name of Don James from NADI, North American Division Evangelism Institute at the time. Don and Ruth James, they moved to not Staten Island, Roosevelt Island in the East River, this parcel of land, and they moved into a high-rise, and they stayed for 2 months. And a lot of money was invested in their being there and serving there, because they went again to engage in urban mission. But for 2 months, after the 2 months, they went home. They went back to Berrien Springs, Michigan. They came home to Andrews University. So with that kind of short-term span, how much impact you think you'll get out of that? You see? There must be a commitment to stay, a commitment to be there, a commitment to be part and parcel of that community if it is going to be meaningful and impactful. A commitment to stay will show that the individual truly has the city in his or her heart. Can I hear somebody say amen? All right. Then the urban mission must also be, all right, they're catching up with me, let's go. The urban mission must also be theological. It must be what, everybody? Theological. God's love for the city is undeniable and unmistakable. Do you believe that? I know I do. The aim of urban mission must be to bring the city to Jesus Christ, who wept over Jerusalem. And urban Christology for the 21st century must of necessity focus on Christ, who was ever to be found where the people were. All right, so we got to go where the people are, and they are in the urban centers of the world today. Were Jesus Christ to come to earth today, he would undoubtedly be found among the teeming millions that crowd our cities, hoping to find purpose and meaning. Where would Jesus be found? In the city for God. How do we respond with integrity to well-intentioned Seventh-day Adventists who believe that in the counsel of Ellen White, we should flee the city? How do we respond with integrity to such? What does it mean in the here and now for Christians to be incarnationally committed to the city? Does it mean that for Christian urban ministry to be credible, Christians must live in the city, engaging in a ministry of presence in the flesh? And then why do you think salvation history ends in a city? We began in a garden, but God is building a city. Amen, somebody. Salvation history, we started in a garden, but God is building a city. Why do you think salvation history ends in a city? How does anticipation of life in the New Jerusalem inform and shape the missional call to life in the cities of our world? We have been called, and we have been called to life in the city. We must embrace it. We must engage in that life in the city with intentionality and with integrity, theologically, recognizing again that even though salvation or the history of civilization may have started in a garden, God is building a city. Questions? Yes. What's the question, sir, please? Mm-hmm. 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 Well, all right. Well, and that is to be bemoaned that the church is silent when it comes to urban mission, particularly in this context, in this society, in this culture. That is to be bemoaned, and that is to be challenged, and that needs to change. That does need to change. The church should not be silent. The church should be speaking out against these kinds of inequities and these kinds of realities which fly in the face of justice and social ministry, etc., and does not reflect what God has called us to be. So you're absolutely right in raising that as a critical issue that needs to be looked at, that needs to be addressed, particularly in a place here on the continent like Johannesburg, where there has been, in this country I should say, where there have been apartheid, and where race continues to be a defining issue that bedevils the church. All right?
Okay, my last comment
Yes.
is that in South Africa, both the urbanized and the ruralized live together. It's a very serious and heavy topic, which is why this church has never, in my life, discussed urban mission. Because there are worms we need to remove from this whole thing.
And that is why we are delighted at Open University to be entering this partnership with the field here to offer the Master of Arts in Urban Ministry, because we recognize again that urban mission is a critical area that needs addressing, and that holds the and that urban mission really is the answer to many of the challenges that we face. We need to become more adept and adroit at strategies, again, that will move the church forward in the urban context and that will usher in the kingdom of God. Yes, there's a brother back here.
Thank you, Elder. My concern on this urban ministry is that we have a lack of leadership in this country, and I'm going to explain why. The Zambian model has been an interesting case study for me. When they reached a 1 million mark, it took one union president to make a decision and to follow the script of the spirit of prophecy, that no one should drive to church, but we need to walk to church. And this is the problem we are having in the South African context. 95% of all my members in my churches, they drive kilometers to church. And that is why you had mentioned that we compromise our integrity because we have nothing to do with the community. We come in and we go out. And people can't relate. They just see people who dress well, who can make noise here, and they are out for the whole 6 days. So the day we become 7 days Adventist, not just the 7th day Adventist, it will make a difference. But this is what I want to bring. We've got what we call maintenance managers, fire extinguishers managers. And this is what makes us to be saying, if we could just have leadership to say, let everybody worship where he stays, we will see exponential growth in this country. And churches will begin to overflow because we run away from our colleagues. That is why Calvin was birthed. I had to tell the Calvin members, why do you drive to Soweto when you leave people where you are staying? Do you think they will go to Soweto and be with you? And this church was birthed.
All right, thank you, my dear brother. We appreciate your comments and observations. What time do we? It looks to me like we're getting out of time, but we're 1 minute over time, so shall we continue? What does it mean to be 1 minute over? What does it mean to be 1 minute over time?
Okay. Thank you for...
Just take one? Okay, one more question.
All right. I think there's a point that you highlighted on the clergy, that is the pastors. I've noticed that the Roman Catholic Church as a denomination, wherever they buy land, they build a church, and they also build the pastor's house. And
parish.
that, a parish, yes, and that has made their ministry advance in a community. And then with us, I think I allude to the other speakers, our pastors stay, or our members as well, stay far away from the community, right? And the relevance of being a pastor or a church member where you don't stay becomes null and void. And your ministry is literally weak. So I think as Saul, I've got my doctor there, as young as I am in ministry, I've learned that if I migrate from a community, I must have membership where I am. I live in a community that is full of crime and so forth. And my wife in a few days was saying, why are we still staying here? I said, because our church is here. If I have to leave this place and go to Santin Church, or go to Golden Harvest, or go to Blue Hills, I must reside within that area. So I think we need to be relevant to where we stay and to where we worship, so that our ministry becomes effective as urban ministry. Thank you.
Amen. Well, that's exactly what we were saying, underscoring, emphasizing. We need to be a part and parcel of the community in which we serve, and not engage in drive-by ministry. So thank you for that. All right.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. This is a vitally important area for the Adventist Church, and again, because cities continue to attract people and populations continue to arise in the urban centers. If we move away from the urban community, we'll be moving away from where the people are, and we know that Jesus was to be found where the people were. And if we are followers of Christ, then we ourselves will be found where he would be, were he amongst us today. God bless you as we respond to this missional call to life in the city. God bless.